My name is James Lee. I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books, which I urge you all to get online and have a look at. But not right now, because we're here to talk about Amy Whiting, which is the pen name of Joan Fraser. A very interesting writer who had a very interesting career, as I think Kate is going to explain. She was recipient of the Patrick White Award in 1993. She came to writing quite late, which is an award specifically for Australian writers who were deemed to be sort of underappreciated or neglected. And we're going to be talking about probably her best-known novel, I for Isabel, which came out in 1989, which was shortlisted for the 1990 Miles Franklin Award. Now, as just a sort of slight apology now, my understanding is that this book is, as of this moment, out of print. So apologies if you did actually try to get a copy and couldn't find one. My understanding is that it is going to be reissued, though, very shortly in the Text Classics series. Now, to talk about I for Isabel, I have with me Kate Kennedy. Kate, fresh from grappling with Infinite Jest on the first Tuesday book club. Now, Kate, I'm sure you are familiar with Kate. She's a novelist, a short story writer, a poet and a memoirist. She's a winner of numerous prizes and accolades, including winning the Age Short Story Award twice. She's won the Vincent Buckley Poetry Prize, C.J. Dennis Prize for Poetry, and her most recent book, Like a House on Fire, was shortlisted for the inaugural Stella Prize. So, without further ado, Kate, if you'd like to...
James. Thank you.
Your lecture.
It'll give me a chance to somehow work through this enormous pile of notes before we applaud, shall we? Because I feel quite uncomfortable actually standing at a lectern. I'm not an academic and I'm not a lecturer in any kind of way, but I thought what I would try and talk about tonight with this terrific book is to give it the context I think it deserves, which is to talk a bit about Amy Whiting herself and the kind of life that she led, which I think was transmuted so beautifully into this book, and clearly what made it such a critical and public success, because that came as quite a surprise to a lot of people, how much this book resonated with such a wide variety of people, both here and overseas. So I thought what I would do is just briefly, if I can, talk about her life prior to this book coming out, because, in case you don't know, it came out when the author was 71 years old, which is quite a late start. But it doesn't mean that she wasn't writing all her life. That was just the point at which she was recognised as the writer that she was. The book, to me, before I begin, I wanted to say is really fundamentally about the making of an artist, with the kind of archetypal, I don't want to use the word journey, but for once it's appropriate, the journey that has to happen when someone becomes an artist, which involves a kind of an estrangement from your life, to the point where you're almost split in two. You sort of cope with alienation and with adversity, almost to the point of breakdown, and then go into a kind of an exile, and then you remake yourself somehow, because you have to, and you come back to that sort of home culture, transformed, which is what happens so beautifully and vividly in this book. There's a beautiful part of the book too that Isabel herself talks about, which seems to me to really ring true about the state of that alienation and estrangement almost from yourself, the need to turn back to what your internal material is and make something out of it, where it comes in the book where she's talking about what she calls the word factory, which is the treadmill of kind of writing and expertise and academia and people understand literature and talking about it and having all this kind of knowledge. She resists that world of the word factory. It's like a treadmill. She calls it mouse wheels of the word factory. But then she says there's a deeper reason, but it has no words. It is a landscape, an unlighted desert, strewn with epic lumber, dead machines, stopped clocks, all my own work. Call it inertia, which just seems to sum up so beautifully to me, the kind of imperative that makes us start, to get ourselves out of that inertia, to make us start writing. And this is what happens, of course, to this character. So I'll talk a bit about the life of this quite remarkable woman. Remarkable to me because she was an ordinary person who lived an ordinary life. She was a teacher and wrote kind of like me and probably a lot of you in the time she was able to carve out of an ordinary life which was making another kind of a living. She was publicly invisible for most of her long life. She was a young woman in the 1930s, which, as you would know, was a very difficult time in terms of social conditions and family circumstances and so on, made it impossible for her to consider becoming a full-time writer, although it was a quest, a background quest for her for many, many years. She was she went to Sydney University and knew James Macaulay and lots of other writers of that time who went on to become prominent Australian poets, academics and writers, but she became a teacher, as I said, and travelled into rural and regional Australia as a high school teacher, writing whenever she could. She wrote short stories, she wrote poetry, and she worked for many years trying to piece together a novel. But it was only in later life, after retiring from teaching, that the publication of this, which was her second novel, I for Isabel, attracted the attention of readers and critics. And as I said, at age 71, that was an unusually late start. But after that recognition, a lot of other work came in a rush. After that time, she then went on to produce more collections of short stories, more novels, more books of poetry, and that continued until her death in 2001. Now, just to give you an idea of what her background was, she was born in Annandale. Her father was a postman, a postal worker. She was born Joan Fraser in 1918, and she was the eldest of three sisters. Now, those of you who went to a convent school or a Catholic school will identify with young Joan. She did go to local school, St Brendan's, and one thing that appears a lot in the book is the kind of the childhood kind of wrestling with ideas of sin, with ideas of lying, with ideas of how you live your life as a good person, and you live with the hypocrisy of what you can see around you and so on. But also, she was bewildered, I think, as she says later in life, by the kind of religious hypocrisy she saw in her own life as well. Her peers really didn't understand her exceptional intellect. She was one of those people who was really punished for being smart. And she was also physically ill a lot of the time. And what later, when she was a teacher, at age about 35, working in the country in a school, there was a routine tuberculosis check amongst the students, and to everyone's amazement, their teacher was the one who turned out to have tuberculosis. It was Amy Whiting herself that had TB, and that explained how she'd been sick so much as a child. And she spent about 5 months in the Blue Mountains at a sanatorium trying to get better. She responded well to treatment. And in that time, funnily enough, when she finally had a bit of time to herself, when she was recuperating from TB, that was the time that she began to write more short stories as well, trying to fill in some empty time, I guess. She claimed later that this environment of being at Annandale, going to the convent school, at least provided her with an inexhaustible subject, one that recurs throughout her prose and poetry, and that is the idea of survival. Survival with an adversity, survival against odds and so on. She was an avid reader and retreated from reality into a rich inner world. And I think it's important to understand, I mean, a lot of people have looked at Amy Whiting's life and then looked at the life of Isabel and I for Isabel and wondered how autobiographical it is. Amy Whiting's had several things to say about this. She claimed not to be a confessional writer, but she also said many times that it wouldn't be possible to write a book like I for Isabel if not to base it on personal experience. So there seems to be so many parallels that it's kind of worth considering some of the things that she brings to bear on the book. There does seem to be a recurring family pattern in lots of her short stories, which is that there is a kind of a neurotic mother who persecutes a scapegoated child, as Susan Sheridan in her study of Whiting has pointed out, and the father's kind of effectively absent or very ineffectual in some way, and then this victim figure, usually seen by others as unacceptably different in some way, develops a kind of inner world, the kind of secretive inner world that enables her to cling to a belief in herself and to survive and reinvent herself. She actually went to quite a prestigious school in secondary school, the Fort Street Girls' School. Once again ostracised because she was top of the class. I think James Macaulay at the same time was going to the Fort Street Boys' High School. But as an example of the fact that Joan was quite a feisty young woman, she actually sat for the entrance exam for this school without actually telling her parents. So she had a fairly strong will, an independent will from an early age. Now, at the age of 16, something great happened. Writing under a pseudonym, she won a poetry competition in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1934. She wrote a poem called Wanderers, and as I said, her pseudonym didn't actually say that she was a 16-year-old schoolgirl, but it seems the staff at the paper were considerably dismayed and surprised to find that they were handing over a pretty big monetary prize to a 16-year-old schoolgirl. But there she was. She had this kind of precocious talent. At the University of Sydney, where she went, she studied English, Latin, French and German, and became part of what Peter Coleman called the sourly brilliant literary circle that included James Macaulay and Harold Stewart and so on. And there's a chapter in I for Isabel where Isabel does try to kind of ingratiate herself with a sort of a coterie of university students who are all very, very smart and intellectual and read a whole lot of stuff that she's never come across, and she feels very kind of not ostracised but really kind of intimidated by their knowledge. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree, but because her father died on the day of her final French exam at the end of 1937, she had to just join the workforce straight away, undertaking a series of jobs that she described as not my brightest year. At this point, her mother also went out to work at David Jones' department store, so you get this feeling that things were pretty tight, including the fact that when she went back to university to gain a teacher's college scholarship and get a diploma of education, she couldn't afford the £3 to buy a copy of her own certificate. So once again, she had quite a strong will and she wanted to get that education, but I think things seemed to be pretty tough financially. Now, she met Donald Horne during this time, and in his book, The Education of Young Donald, he provides a very interesting kind of view of her and remembers her well at university. At 17, he mentions that she rolled her own cigarettes. She paid for her own coffee, and this is in his words, she talked softly in a monotone, using not pitch, but a certain kind of word stress to create emphasis. But she talked very musingly and wryly, introducing me to the throwaway style of soft, confident under-emphasis. And that soft, confident under-emphasis is something that I find very characteristic of Whitting's work. Now, it's one of those things too, you look at this kind of era that they're at in university in Sydney in the 30s, and Horne tells us that as a young man he thought that writing verse was all that mattered, and he thought that all of his poetry writing colleagues except Macaulay were in fact very minor poets, and when he found out that Joan was writing a novel, or trying to write a novel, he kind of just avoided her because it just seemed beyond the pale that she would try. Now, as for Joan herself, she found that university was not all it was cracked up to be. As she says, she found it very disappointing. I was so looking forward to it, to be amongst one's peers, amongst all those ideas and thoughts. But she was constrained, of course, by family and society and finances, as well as the fairly competitive and high-flying fellow students. In one of her short stories, she describes a French medieval contraption, like a torture cage, in which people who were put inside the cage couldn't stand up, sit down or lie down. They just had this endless torture of not being able to get comfortable, and that's later in life how she described her days when she was there. Her inner life at the time, she said, was like one of those torture cages. There was immense internal and external pressures, of course. She, in once interviewed with Peter Craven, she said that what she was aware of was beneath that facade of university life, world events were impinging. And there was this undercurrent going on. There was lots of uncertainty about the future. And Macaulay says the same thing, that he just found it all a bit gestural in the end. It just seemed like an empty kind of time. She did say, I spent my life trying to emerge from that Sydney University group, trying to find a normal life. So when she finished the diploma, she went to teach, and she had an appointment at a school called Riverside Domestic Science School in 1940, where she says her career began in disaster. She says, being trained to teach French and German and never having been out of an elite class, I was set to teach general subjects in what I now know as a class of slow learners. What I must have done to those poor children haunts me still. And then she went to Canamble, an isolated town in New South Wales. And throughout this period, she wrote kind of what she called practice, short stories about her experiences, about back life and the characters that she met, while also developing her confidence as a teacher. In 1948, when she was working in Kempsey, she met her husband, Les Livick, who was an industrial arts teacher, and they got married and continued living in Kempsey until she had to go to the sanatorium in the Blue Mountains. And then when she was out of there, they went back to live in Sydney for a while, and they had a son, Gregory, who was born 1954. They bought an old farmhouse, and she kept on teaching, this time at Cheltenham Girls High School, where she met an important person in her life, a colleague, whose name was Thea Astley. Isn't that great? Now, what had happened was, many years before, Joan had given herself the pen name of Amy Whitting. She invented it in that first unhappy stint as a teacher, in her first placement. She had a headmistress who sounds very much like Mrs. Callaghan, the mother in I for Isabel, who tyrannised and bullied her, in her words. Her name was Amy Wisht. Joan said, well, she understood the woman was frustrated and suffering, like the mother figure in I for Isabel. She never lost a kind of perspective and compassion in that way. You can't give yourself entirely over, she said, to your suffering and take it out on others unwittingly. You needed awareness, perspective, the ability to step back and not perpetrate your own trauma on others, in other words. So like many women before her, she made a conscious decision to choose a name that offered protection and, as she said, an ability to move into a self-forgetfulness, a world where I don't count. It's so self-effacing, isn't it? So she resolved never to be unwitting or unconscious in her dealings with herself and others. So Whitting became her name, her pseudonym, a moral resolve before she actually began to use it as a pen name. So by the time she had started working at Cheltenham School in 1957, the year before, she had a short story accepted in Southerly magazine, 1956. And it must have been a great moment when she met Thea Astley, who'd read the story the year before and been impressed by it, and said, "You can't be Amy Whitting." And she said, "I am." And the friendship developed. Now, it was Astley who therefore encouraged her to send some short stories out, including to the preeminent literary magazine of the day, The New Yorker. She sent a story called The Weight of a Man, which they rejected, with a very encouraging sort of "please try us again" letter. So she did. She sent a story that Thea Astley liked as well, called Goodbye Adie, Goodbye Joe, a story based on real flood, which happened in Kempsey, involving characters she later said that she'd kind of made up as composites based on a story that she'd heard and listened to while she was living there. So it was in The New Yorker. And the second one, that was done in 1965, and 3 years later, 3 or 4 years later, one called The Early Settler appeared, but it had been edited without her consent. And here's the thing that I find really interesting. That was it for her. Because that had happened, she vowed that she wouldn't send any more to The New Yorker. And that seems very characteristic of that early kind of feistiness. Now, during this time, Astley introduced her to lots of people, including Patrick White and Hal Porter. Now, it's interesting to note that when Patrick White met her first at Thea Astley's house, it was he who asked her for advice. He sought her advice on the techniques of short story writing, because he was about to try writing in this form himself for the first time. Again, when Amy's short story of the harsh Australian outback called The Survivors was published in 1975 in the British magazine Stand, Patrick White wrote to her again with a complimentary letter. But I just thought you would love to hear this letter from Patrick White. He wrote, "I thought the story well written. You get the idiom marvellously. The characters are alive, but I wish you would write about people who interest me more. After working with sheep for a couple of years in my youth, I'm allergic to them, and particularly to those who deal with them." Now imagine someone writing to Patrick White saying, "I wish you would write about people who interested me more," and what Patrick White might have to say in response. This story, The Survivors, which is more like a novella actually, was described as a minor masterpiece, and once again draws heavily on the experiences that Joan had had while she was living in country towns during the worst of World War II and during a major drought. It describes that sort of life in the story. Now, along with Kenneth Slessor, these authors offered support and encouragement while she was effectively being ignored by the Australian literary establishment, but she was also very, very busy, concluding her teaching career as Mistress of Modern Languages at North Sydney Girls' School, where she held that position for 7 years. When she was questioned about how little she put out during those years, she said that her creative ability was channeled into her teaching. And after she retired, she kept on teaching English as a second language for 20 years more. And according to her files, her literary papers, she answered every letter she ever received from students who wrote to her to thank her in later life. And she was always willing to speak at teachers' conferences and take part in judging and writing competitions. Apparently, I didn't go to this festival, but 1996, apparently, she suffered in later life from macular degeneration and had to have a speaking machine to do her writing and so on, and she was plagued with this. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, for a writer? But apparently in 1996, at the Adelaide Writers' Festival, she recited some of her own poems just from memory because she couldn't read them anymore. Now, in late 1997, with the publication of her novel The Visit, her first novel, it drew some critical attention. And she was now 59 years old and retired from teaching. She was a housewife, that's what she called herself. But those years of first-hand observation and stored knowledge and intimate knowledge, really, of the social life of rural and outback Australia gave her the characters for that book. Bangaree, the country town that's in the book, is really just disguised Kempsey in mid-northern New South Wales. And although it received good reviews, the hardback was soon remaindered and didn't come out again in paperback until 1991, following the overwhelming success of I for Isabel. So she was spurred on by the impetus of this published novel to start again, to put some of these small things together, to make a novel. And it had a very, very, very long genesis, I think, this novel, with material coming from what she called the vast, probably unreadable novel that she wrote called The Iron Ration, that she began in 1939. 2 rework sections were published earlier as short stories, but basically she said it just made her too much to go into the material to write about. It was hard work for her to write the book. She completed it in 1979, and it was accepted by Thomas Nelson, who published The Visit, the first book. But in 1980, Nelson suddenly returned I for Isabel, unaccepted it, unwilling to publish it because, as they said, they believed it would not sell as it, quote, attacked the sacrosanct institution of motherhood. This is 1980. The novel was consigned to a drawer, and that's where it stayed for 10 years. Whitting later admitted that poetry would have been my wish. In fact, she turned back to poetry in this time, in the next 10 years. That was she said she was adversely influenced by the often patronising, unsupportive attitude of her male colleagues, whose general stance was that they were the bards, unquote. So she'd resisted this intuitive leaning towards poetry all her life, but with that decision to write no more prose, the years between 1977 and 1985 became a sort of a specific poetry period, and she was published in Quadrant and Overland, and how's this? She put all of those things together into a book of poetry called Travel Diary, and she self-published it in 1985. And in 1987, she gave the manuscript of I for Isabel, which had been rejected, to one of her students who had connections with publishing the house Curtis Brown in London. This publisher reacted ecstatically and recommended the novel to Penguin Australia, which published it in 1989 to considerable acclaim. And far from readers being outraged by the attacking of the sacrosanct institution of motherhood, they actually responded with relief that they identified with very similar childhood experiences. Critics and the public alike were shocked and exhilarated by the book. It's remained her most popular work, with many people strongly relating to Isabel's sense of isolation and quest for identity, that massive archetypal theme, as I said, of kind of moving from alienation into an exile where you kind of are dismantled by your alienation and you have to remake yourself and then return and come back a different person. And how are you going to come back? You're going to come back as an artist. someone who can actually make something out of this experience. It's documenting that experience away from an unhappy childhood, coming to terms with what she names and dreads, the word factory, and seizing the confidence she wants to become a writer. It did very, very well in the United States and was reviewed by the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. And Janet Turner Hospital declared it a stunning and original work. She says, Whitting lays bare with surgical precision the dynamics of families, siblings, students in coffee shops, office coteries. One sometimes feels positively winded with unsettling insights. There's something relentless, almost unnerving in her anatomising of foibles, fears, obsessions, private shame, the nature of loneliness, the nature of panic. And the book was, in fact, an artistic turning point. It won the Fellowship of Australian Writers, Barbara Ramsden Award in 1989, was shortlisted, as you said, for the Miles Franklin, the Banjo Awards, and became a book that was on the secondary and tertiary reading lists. Looking back, Whitting recalls that after that long battle, she says, it was like a stone rolling away. I haven't stopped since. And she didn't. It was certainly true. After the publication of I for Isabel, she had this burst of confidence with older books being republished. And from this time forward, 1989, until her death, she published 4 novels, 2 volumes of poetry, 2 collections of short stories, cementing her reputation as a significant Australian writer and receiving the Patrick White Award in 1993, which, as James said, is a prize for an author who has not received sufficient recognition of their talents. So why this book for me, I guess? Why does this one really appeal to me? I'm interested in something. I just want to start by mentioning, there's a quote from an author called Piers Anthony in the US. He talks about childhood in a way which I think is really relevant to the way that Whitting has dealt with childhood in this book. He says, one thing you who had secure or happy childhood should understand about those of us who did not. We who control our feelings, who avoid conflicts at all costs or seem to seek them, who are hypersensitive, self-critical, compulsive, workaholic, and above all, survivors. We are not that way from perversity, and we cannot just relax and let go. We've learned to cope in ways you have never had to. And that, to me, kind of really sums up the kind of environment in which a character like Isabel comes into the world. She is repressed. Her mother is abusive, disturbed, neurotic. She punishes her. She is the outsider. She's too smart for her schoolmates. She's abrupt and seems arrogant, and she's awkward socially. She's always walking on eggs because she's never been sort of given that confidence in herself as a young person. So she kind of is such a person of her time. But what happened, of course, when Amy Whitting took years and years and years to think about this book, I suppose, and try and put it together, it had an awfully long gestation. I like to think about this kind of stillness in the sense of the way that Judith Wright did, because Judith Wright, as well as Amy Whitting and many other female writers of this era, lamented that what they did as writers was kind of the housewife jobs, as she says. The trivialisation of life is a real problem for women, says Judith Wright, dealing so much with what's regarded as a trivial, and trying to find your own value system and live by the values of a serious writer is very difficult when you haven't got what you might call a support base. What's lacking, she wrote this letter to Barbara Blackman in 1952, is the creative stillness, the refusal to impose oneself on events, the refusal to be imposed upon. It's very difficult to do, but one thing I think Amy Whitting did was just say no, just remove herself from that life, just have an ordinary life, an ordinary working life, and to distance herself from that literary world that she found so kind of competitive and quite corrosive to her spirit, to create for herself that lengthy gestation of creative stillness. Other things took up her attention, and she didn't impose herself on events and wasn't imposed upon. So when she came to write this book, she invoked material from her childhood and adolescence which had been rested and turned over for many, many years. So what it brings to bear in the book is a kind of a wisdom and a kind of a compassion, which I remember when I first read it, just struck me as incredibly, it was wise. I want to just read a little part of it on page 12 to let you know what I'm saying, because this is the woman she's describing, her mother, Mrs. Callaghan, you would have to say is a kind of a monster of cruelty. They're on holidays somewhere, and her mother has said, we're not going to mention to anybody it's your birthday, there's no present for you this year, it's all too, it's too hard, you don't need a present, you're very spoilt. And so this poor little kid is kind of hoping and waiting for maybe a surprise present, but knows there's not going to be one. And at the table, when they're all at the guest house having lunch, a little parcel arrives. She's let it slip to someone, one of the other guests who's bought her a little something. And Mrs. Callaghan has recovered and says in her company voice, "How kind of you." She's very genteel. "It's only a small thing," said Mr. Mansell. "Oh, but you shouldn't have." Chancing on a useful phrase in a foreign language, he said graciously, "She's spoilt enough already." Now, when the mother says this, there is immediate hostility amongst the other guests who just think she's gone too far. There was a disturbance, a kind of gust of breathing at grown-up face level around the table. Isabel looked up and saw that all the grown-ups were turning on her mother with the same glare of indignation, except Mr. Mansell, who was looking at Isabel herself with a bright, soft look that puzzled her, and her pale father, who was going steadily on with his task of cutting, chewing and swallowing. Her mother, for once, was even paler than he, so white-faced that traces of an earlier colouring showed russet in her hair and green in her eyes. She was staring at her plate, plying her knife and her fork slowly and carefully like crutches. Isabel felt an ache of sympathy, knowing how it felt to be the last to be chosen or even left out of the game. An idea of, despite everything, what she can feel is sympathy, that pang of compassion and empathy, is something that I just find really powerful in the kind of ordinariness of Amy Whiting's subject matter and the way she writes. So I'll talk with James in a minute about the kind of structure of the book and why it's so interesting. But I'm just going to go through some of these to talk about why, as I said, this appealed to me so much when I first saw it. It didn't surprise me at all to see that it was Jessica Anderson who wrote on the cover, wrote a review for this book when it first came out, and is actually on the cover talking about how distinctive and compelling it is. Because, like Nora Porteous in her novel Tirulura by the River, this is the portrait of an artist who does not know yet that she's an artist. Like Anderson herself, Whiting had to wait for easier financial circumstances to actually even start writing about that and make the time to write. This state of being ignorant of your own ignorance makes, for me, a classic kind of protagonist in a work of fiction. We want to see a character learning what they're made of, a character placed under duress due to their own trauma or limitations or what's imposed upon them, to be put to the test. And I have to say, I was totally unaware of Amy Whiting myself when I was at school and when I studied Australian women writers in the mid-80s at university. She just was not on the syllabus. And I had an education very like Isabel. I went to a convent school where you did get punished for being smart, and what the nuns wanted us to do was become teachers or become nurses, or best of all, just get married and have children. That would be the best possible career. So we did study poetry, but let me tell you, we studied Ted Hughes but not Sylvia Plath, if you know what I mean. We just didn't study any female poets at all. So by the time I got to university, I had a lot of reading to do, a lot of catching up to do, and I can only blame myself, of course, for my ignorance of Amy Whiting at this point, since I was actually compiling for my thesis, I use that term very loosely, a cross-section of work by Australian women writers to analyse and compare their female characters' trajectories within their stories and study those books' archetypes and preoccupations, because, hey, it was the mid-80s, that's what we used to do. And let me stress, the thesis is now long since mercifully burnt. Okay. And I covered books by Jessica Anderson, by Glenda Adams, Kate Grenville, Susan Johnson, Beverly Farmer, and a host of others, charting that terrific, archetypal pattern of what Hélène Cixous, the French feminist, called trying to make a life outside the fortress, of course, being the patriarchy, and it was women having to leave that fortress to make their own lives and then try and return to that fortress out of exile and transforming it, making it something different. So that splitting away to risk madness and alienation, dismantle and remake yourself, as I said earlier, in that emotion, that's not a new idea. That's been around since Homer, obviously. But I was struck at the time by how faithfully it was being mapped and repeated in the fiction that I studied that came out in the decade between 1975 and 1985 when I was writing it. And of course, when I for Isabel was published in 1989, just 4 years too late for my rather callow analysis, it recreated this archetype with such skill and understated verve that it's the one book I actually remember in my life finishing and then turning back to page 1 to start again. It was just done so beautifully, and I found it so full of incredible parallels, as I'm sure many, many readers would have done. That idea of a childhood in which you are just not heard, and you're living in a kind of conventional or a constrained world where the only way out is to have a kind of a breakdown or a breakthrough in some way, to get away from it, and then to kind of dismantle that, as Isabel says in the book. When she creates this character of Isabel, showing the splits and strains and stress fractures of trying to fit despite that awful abuse and tyranny from her mother, who is also, of course, going mad herself inside the fortress, of course, in that analysis. It shows the price to be paid for this, the artist's essential alienation and loneliness. So the book is very much like, say, The Bell Jar in that way, those other kinds of coming-of-age books that involve female protagonists. This separation of self into a kind of a secretive observer who'll later find a way somehow to re-emerge and record it all. Whiting talks about being compelled by this inner voice herself, that commentating voice that won't be quiet, that won't sit still, and, is very adept at using metaphors to talk about those things herself. Isabel has an epiphany, or revelation, I guess you'd say, in the book. As she's reading, there's a beautiful thing at the end of the book where she realises that she's misjudged something really important in her life, and it's been a source of trauma all this time. But when she revisits that time in her life and goes back to it, she realises that the whole thing is based on a kind of misunderstanding. That's her mother and her father who have made her feel something that actually is not the case at all in real life. It says, while she was reading, lots of things came back. There's a writer in there, Isabel, a naked infant, greased and trussed in the baking dish with an apple jammed in its mouth. There was such a feeling of limbs stretching, of hands unbound. She knew she could choose to be a writer. A pen and an exercise book, that was all it took, to be a rotten writer anyway. Good or rotten, that came later. It meant giving in to the word factory. And she goes and buys herself an exercise book and a pen at the newsagent's. And as she catches sight of herself in this mirror, she's been crying and her hair's all wild, and here's this mad woman straight out of the wilderness, out of the emotional exile. She catches sight of her unadorned raw emotion on display to the world, and she thinks to herself, this is the happiest moment of my life. It's a great moment in the book. Anyway, I could talk for a long time about the book, and I will, of course, with James, but I just wanted to say something that happened that really shows the kind of writer that she was. When this thing about submitting work to the New Yorker, where she decided because she'd been edited without her permission, she wasn't going to submit any more work. Now, it just kind of shows how torn she was, and how that kind of hypersensitive, contradictory, uncertain attitude to her own talents, how diffident she felt, how sensitive she felt to criticism and things happening without her consent. Because you can see this in the way that she reacts. The first thing she did was she wrote to the New Yorker, and it's what she wrote to them. Sorry, I didn't have a large talent, and I wanted to keep myself available for any ideas that turned up. It's very self-effacing, isn't it? Today at Turner Hospital later, years later, she said, well, they can like me or leave me. What's a New Yorker anyway? But then she restated what she told the magazine, saying she felt out of her depth and lacking the breadth of experience to go on writing for them. It's interesting with Geordie Williamson talking about this book in his book about sort of literature of Australia called The Burning Library. He uses a beautiful image of women writers are like kind of scorpions saving the sting for themselves, stinging their own selves into paralysis, turning the blowtorch of their kind of critical capacity back on themselves to make sure that they're the ones who are silenced. And I think that is a really poignant thing that you can see in just how little Amy Whiting was recognised before this book came out. She did describe herself once as a failed poet and said she was out-talented by her colleagues, but she also said she lacked the egotistical sublime that animated her male contemporaries at the university. And of course she was a realist writer, as I said, who was dealing with themes that I also find myself responding to a lot. Perennial themes of love and hate, time, death, mortality, ordinary life, how people react to it, how people cope, how we all survive. And they are kind of essential philosophical concerns, I guess. But because I don't want to talk for too long, I want to have some time to talk. I just wanted... Are we really running straight over?
Oh, no, go.
Okay, beautiful. She talks a bit about the balance between the intrusion of the outside world and the inner world of the writer, which makes great short stories, she says. And in fact, Barry Oakley did describe her as the Australian Chekhov, and I tend to agree. I think her short stories are fantastic as well, with these distinctive themes that she has of rejection and shame and struggling for retribution, identity, and so on. But listen to the reviews, the titles of the reviews through the different decades to her work. I've just taken a few at random. About The Visit in 1977, this was the title of the review. Housewife Scribbler turns out a minor masterpiece. I for Isabel, 1989. A writer comes in from the cold, Sydney Morning Herald. I for Isabel, New York Times book review. She wants to be a human. The Bulletin, 1990. A cuddly kind of power. Winning the Patrick White Prize in 1993. Understated writer honoured. How's this one from the Adelaide Advertiser, 1993? Top Literary Award to Woman Author. Doesn't that remind you of when Kate Atkinson won the Orange Prize and it said, Top Literary Prize won by Chambermaid? 1994, The Weekend Australian, starting a new life after 30 domestic years. 1994, A Woman Not Made for Fame. 1995, The Age, Weird Tales About School Teachers and Twin-Setted Librarians. The Courier Mail, 95, Cardboard Cutouts. And last of all, in her obituary that Peter Craven wrote, Literary Wildflower Bloomed Amid Neglect. And yet, when her collection of poetry came out, Beauty is the Straw, the person who wrote the review on the back was Les Murray, paying tribute to this second collection of poetry, stating that she is a talent we can confidently call major and an intelligent poet, fully the equal of the brightest anywhere. The fact is proved not least by her never forgetting that a poem must also move us. A poet of reserve and genuine independence of mind, she has been slow to attract attention, in part because she has not anxiously sought it. Discerning readers, however, have been amazed that so fine a poet could have been working unnoticed at such a level of achievement. Now, I just wanted to finish with not an extract from the book, but a poem that coincidentally was published in the Sydney Morning Herald 43 years after Wanderers, her prize-winning poem at age 16 was published in 1934. This came out in 1977. And this poem also, I feel, is one of those things that just encapsulates so beautifully someone who's trying to live a full and ordinary life, making something out of it, and trying to pay tribute to the ordinariness of that stuff, and trying to do it justice by gathering those stories, like Faulkner, I guess, like Hemingway, and putting them together in such a way that they move us, whether they're a short story or a novel or a poem. This poem is called Housewife. As I said, it was published, one of the few poems she had published in 1977. Housewife. If you ask me what I'm knitting on my quick-moving needles, out of the kind smile and the little lottery win, out of the sunlight moving on moving leaves, out of a new recipe and a hint for cleaning silver, it's a net. If you ask me what I'm weaving, with fingers that work against time, out of the little dinner, out of the lampshade braided in plastic ribbon, and the evening college course in current affairs, out of the theatre tickets, the library book, and my day with Meals on Wheels, it's a net for under the tightrope. And you may say it's very fine, considering the void below it. It's very fine work indeed, as fine as a spider's web, considering the void below it and the weight of the heart it must hold. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kate. That was fabulous. I'll say just before I start asking Kate some questions that seeing as we are at 7 o'clock, if anyone does have...
Oh my God, sorry.
It's perfectly okay. That's they're here to hear you speak. If you do have any questions, there are some people with the microphone, so just put your hand up and we can incorporate them into the discussion if anyone has any questions.
Fantastic.
But just to pick up on what you were saying, I was interested in your speech where you were talking about the idea of an archetype, a female archetype here, because this is the third novel that we've done. You mentioned Jessica Anderson's Tualuva by the River. We also did Elizabeth Harrower's The Watchtower. Yeah. 3 novels which have really interesting, intelligent, complex female psyches at their centre. All of them all of them look to literature as a kind of escapism, as a way of transcending this kind of domestic existence, the domestic setting of these novels. So, I mean, it's interesting that this. I mean, what is behind that? Do you think that?
Look, I don't know. Do you think it's people? I mean, we make our stories out of what we have, don't we? We spin, and it's like, I think a lot of the time story making is to do with taking something that to us seems incoherent and impossible to understand and explain, and we want to make it coherent. Like the function of creating a story is to try and make sense of it. So I think in lots of ways there's people working out their own lives, which is... It's a pattern, isn't it? And writers are always looking at patterns, and I guess your own pattern is the one that is the most compelling because you're in it, you know, you're totally caught up inside it. And that idea of escaping to the richer world of reading, and that's what Isabel does all the time. In fact, at times under most duress, she just opens a book. She reads Anthony Trollope, you know. She steals books, you know. She tries to enter this other world by trying to find out what they're reading and read it herself and so on. You know?
Yeah, well, it's an escape from the self, but it actually returns her to herself, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah. I mean, you touched on at the very beginning, I think, her Catholicism, and it seems to me that is tied up with her creative development in this novel in really interesting ways.
Yeah, it really is. There's an interesting bit in the book where she steals a book called Lives of the Saints, and it's like her magic talisman, she says, and she wants to open it at any page and see what it might tell her. You know, it's a very Catholic thing to do.
And it's interesting. I mean, my reading of that aspect of the book is that she starts out being oppressed by this religious sensibility, and she doesn't so much overthrow it as kind of appropriate it and secularise it, and it transforms into this creative sensibility.
It depends how you read it. I mean, looking at it another way, you could say if Isabel was alive today, probably would have her diagnosed as being bipolar, you know, because there's that kind of soaring grandiosity of incorporating the great world into me, which is the whole experience of the saint, you know, and then sort of plunging again into these depths of despair where everything seems colourless, like that, what did you say, the great landscape full of lumber and stopped clocks and, you know, things that are dead. It's like there's this incredible kind of emotional life which is just swinging wildly out of control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always feel a little bit hesitant talking about Catholic writers. God, I never had it. You know, I wasn't raised Catholic or anything, and I remember reading the hellfire scenes in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man as an exercise in comic bombast. My wife, who was Catholic, read it and was horrified by it.
It's the literal truth.
But I sort of. Saw a lot of the Catholic stuff in him having a satirical edge to it.
Yes.
The scene, the episode about Grace, where she feels she's been visited by Grace and decides that it's all about kind of detachment and being aloof and calm and non-judgmental, and then she discovers that this state actually grants her power, and it starts. So it kind of, in an attempt to be passive, she takes
away her mother's power, in fact, and she torments her mother even more by not responding. So she works out that in fact you can be removed. And you can use it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, do you see a lot of humour in that, or?
I think that, look, it didn't seem that funny to me, I must say. As someone who was raised a Catholic, there does seem to me to be that, once you're a lapsed Catholic, you're always a lapsed Catholic. It's like being an ex-alcoholic. You're never going to get over that thing, because so much of what you have been taught as a child within your education system and your sort of home life, and what you've been taught in terms of a spiritual religious life, it's hard to extricate yourself ever from that thing, and so you can't actually make that much fun of it, because you understand it's something that necessarily, in order to become an adult, I think you need to escape from. And it's easy to laugh at it now, as you said, in terms of kind of bombast and in terms of looking at it as a ridiculous, absurd state that no one could ever possibly take as real. But you do. When you're a child, it feels like the truth, you know.
Well, yeah, and so, I mean, I saw her as kind of co-opting it, kind of mastering it in the end. I'm not sure if that. But
notice how she also talks about the thing about lying, because she has to split herself away from herself and from her. She doesn't know whether she's telling the truth or telling a lie, you know, which is the ultimate state of self-estrangement, I guess, because she wants to believe that her mother is telling the truth, but of course she's not. Her mother is this flawed person who she needs to see as someone who is needy, you know.
Oh, yes, yeah. It's and that split. She talks about. There's a point in the middle where she talks about the idiot in the attic.
Yes.
Which, you know, I took to be an allusion to Jane Eyre.
Yes.
The mad woman upstairs. But, of course, it's internalised. The idiot in the attic she is her own idiot in the attic.
That's right.
And so she has this kind of weird, there are all these weird inversions where, you know, as you say, she tells the truth. When she tells the truth, people think her mother thinks she's lying, and she's in this state where, you know, she tries to be genuine and it comes across as false.
Yes.
And tries to be.
And that goes on right into her adolescence and her young adulthood too. She can't seem to say the right thing. She's always that outsider perennially, you know.
Yeah, and literature being the kind of escape from that away. I mean, there's the end. I have the line at the end where she's. The book actually turns back on itself in the end, doesn't it? Because she arrives at that point where she has to go back to her home, and she also has. And it's described as going back to the book, you know, to go through it again in order to work out what actually happened. And she comes to the conclusion, and the quote is, the book meant friendship, company at least, communication and understanding. And that's after she's gone back to, you know, and read the lives of the saints again, you know, done her. And
look what she does then. She buys a blank book. And she starts to write, you know. That's sort of like, it does come a full circle, doesn't it? You know?
She says, you are a writer, you are a writer. It's
You're
repeated.
A writer.
You know.
And that beautiful thing where she says, call it inertia, that hell, that land that has nothing alive in it. You're going to make something out of that. You're going to have to move on, and that's to do with pushing yourself away from that inertia, I guess, in order to identify. It's got a really interesting structure, and the book doesn't sort of continue into chapters. It's like 5 small self-contained stories, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned that she's been compared to Chekhov, and she's been described as a realist. But she's one of those writers where the term realist actually seems kind of inadequate, because there's a real psychological intensity there that you don't kind of associate with realism, which is generally seen to be a bit more neutral and disinterested. But there is that real. It's a kind of a psychological novel in a lot of ways, isn't it? I mean,
you know, the thing I loved about it in terms of that structure, because I was thinking to myself, why has she done that? Why would you make that the structure? Why not just carry through an ordinary chronology? You read her short fiction. She is a master at piecing together a kind of a trajectory of a plot line that works beautifully. Why do it like this? Like the sections begin and a whole event has happened. You know, one section it begins and it's her mother's funeral, and you haven't even been privy to her mother's illness or death, or you never find out what's happened. All you know is that their aunties are there now buying them clothes for a funeral because they haven't got enough clothes to wear. And it passes over that thing and obsesses on smaller details in a way which I think is to do with the childlike point of view, the kind of immature, undeveloped point of view, which is it's a blurting kind of intuitive form to me, you know.
Well, yeah, and the theme of guilt is very, very strong one too. I mean, that when she hears about her mother's death, she doesn't feel the grief, and then she feels that there's something wrong with her because she doesn't react in the right way.
She grieves for not being able to grieve. Like it's just the most convoluted, you know. Yeah, she's very repressed, isn't she?
Well, there's quite a nice little counterpoint to that later, where there is this scene with. I've forgotten the character's name, but is it Diane?
Yes.
Yes. Who there's a moment where she's quite a troubled character, and she has she fears that she may be suicidal. Then, unexpectedly, another character is killed in an accident, and she goes to inform Diane of this. And Diane doesn't react in the appropriate way, or in a kind of conventional way. She doesn't. There's no rending of garments. She sort of sits down and starts brushing her hair, and she realises that the grief can take many forms. That people have to process it in lots of different ways.
It's true.
Yeah, this is with the university students, of course, where she's reading Dostoevsky and.
Yeah, and there's that, as I said, there's that fantastic thing that Whitting brings to bear on that, which is an amazing empathy. It's taken, there's years and years of thinking about this, I guess. It's not kind of, nobody is treated, the book has all kinds of flashes of, I think, a real wisdom, where there's a kindness there, or it takes that little kick around and then you see something in a whole other way. And your sympathy for a character is suddenly totally changed by a really precise thing, like the idea of the knife and fork being like crutches, is a really beautiful image to use to make us really aware of what she's trying to show us,
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, there's almost a kind of moralism there too. I mean, it's
really moral.
Yeah, about how to live. I mean, it's about becoming reconciled to yourself, I think, in a lot of ways. The kind of imagery and the symbolism of that is kind of very interesting. I mean, you mentioned in your lecture about her being sort of too smart for her own good in a way. She's constantly saying the wrong thing, not because she's silly, but because she's smart. And her words, I think, described at several points as being like a knife.
And she can see herself doing it, but she can't stop doing it. So she's kind of very self-absorbed in that way, and she's very kind of she internalises all of that, doesn't she? Because she's not very social. She can't interact on an ordinary level. She goes to work at a glassworks factory, and straight away you can see her getting everyone else offside. She doesn't mean to, but she does. And she can't see how she's doing it, but you can see how she's doing it. Which is
there's a comedy of manners in that scene too, when she first gets there and doesn't know how to type and all, and so on. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, is there something that it's part of the theme of, I guess, for want of a better word, the feminist aspect of this book, in that her weapons are words, kind of when I read the scene that kind of is the counterpoint to that is the early one with her mother goading her father over the table, which is passed over quite quickly. It's not turned into a big scene where she. He sits there sort of hiding stoically behind his newspaper, and she goads him to a point one day where he gets up and actually attacks her with a knife. We have this kind of domestic scene, which is it's a tiny incident in this broader psychological drama. So it's kind of that real action is pushed to the margins in certain ways.
That's right, and there's that bit at the end of that where the mother's holding up her hands and the father's got a knife, and he slashes with the knife, and then there's a line of blood that appears on her fingers, and she says at the end they both look shamefaced afterwards. It was like they pushed it, something reached, it sort of erupted into something, and then it was kind of, they could go back to this horrible world of emotional torture instead, and neurotic kind of guiltiness,
Well, I'd just say we are just about out of time, so please do put up your hand if you have any questions? Anybody? No?
Has anybody read the book, I for Isabel? And can I ask, how long ago? Did people read it a long while ago, or is it something that you've read recently? Yeah. Today. Did you get a copy online? Because it's one of those weird things of being out of print, of course. It's a bit like self-publishing a poetry book. It's kind of hard to believe now, isn't it? That that's the way things went, and that things were out of print. And it's great that Text, I guess, next year is going to be re-releasing this book in a new edition, because it's certainly one of those books that we're picking up on that hasn't had enough acknowledgement. I guess
it's a really extraordinary book. I mean, we've done several, I think, really remarkable novels.
Okay, we do have a question actually. Yeah, thank you.
It's actually one of the books, the only books that I have wanted to close and go back again and start all over again, which I've done. And one of the curious things about it is I felt that it was an analysis of someone's decline into mental illness. And I'm surprised to find that that the end to you was upbeat and positive. So I realise I've missed.
No, I
something.
don't think you've missed. I do think she reached rock bottom. I really do think she was out of her mind almost. She was definitely in that wilderness.
Well, there's in the very last chapter there is that detail about her making these abusive phone calls to people. But I think she does in the very last pages. She does kind of recognise the insanity of that, and so pulls herself back. And although that image that you quoted of the baby being put in the oven, it's as as a kind of symbol of her becoming a writer. It's like the baby's out of the oven now. I mean, it's a pretty kind of horrifying symbol.
It's something to overheard her landlady talking about. She does say in one of the quotes I didn't read, she said, I got really good at sitting in boarding houses eavesdropping on what landladies were talking about, and that was obviously one of the stories, that someone in a country town had a sort of breakdown and called out to her husband and was just putting the baby into the oven in a baking tray, and it was this horrific image. And then she uses it herself. She can't forget about that, and she does see herself as that
is pretty
baby
hard to forget.
Trust with an apple in its mouth, about to be sacrificed in this great. I agree with you. As I said, I feel like.
I actually wondered whether that was part of her history, and whether she was putting pieces together. That's why I feel I need to get those pieces together, because maybe that was her experience.
I kind of felt. I'll just explain if people haven't read the book. What happens is she goes back and she talks to a neighbour who says, remember when you wrote that poem that was in the paper? And she remembers being terrified of this neighbour because her parents said, if you go in there, she's going to call the police on you because you brought her name into... You put her name in the paper. And she never really... It's all repressed, that memory. But, of course, the neighbour hasn't felt bad at all. She loved it. She wrote a poem about this lady's cat and it won a competition in the newspaper. Which makes me just really wonder about, again, the parallel in Whitting's own life with winning this prize as a schoolgirl, where I just find myself thinking, is it that she's kind of sacrificed to her own parents' madness in a way, or neurosis at least, and in fact those things are not her fault, that she can forgive herself for those things, that she wasn't this evil person according to the nuns and according to her mother and according to the world that had defined her. In fact, she can not just reconcile herself with herself, but actually create something coherent out of this. I sort of saw that going and buying an exercise book, looking like a mad woman, saying, happiest moment of my life, I'm about to start something. Well, it's a kind of moving out of that insanity.
It's almost like she is discovered what her madness is. Her peculiar madness is to be a writer. In the beginning of that chapter, she wakes up and she sees a stain on the roof, and she starts trying to think of words to describe the stain. She thinks, why am I constantly thinking of words to describe the stain? A stain's a stain. Yeah. But then by the end of the chapter, of course, she has worked out that this is her vocation. I mean, that's I think how I would read it. And so and she appropriates that baby symbol, that appalling sort of comical yet horrifying image, I think, is a kind of ambiguous symbol of arriving at that point. Maybe it's
coming out of helplessness or something, isn't it? Yeah.
Maybe Rimbaud-like kind of the derangement of the senses, and then you arrive at the point of artistry. But
it is, and once, as I said, it's like that idea of you are dismantled by life. Life tears you apart, and then you have to piece yourself back together, and then you need to go back to the fortress. That idea of you need to go back to the thing which has rejected you and be the different thing which is going to be more powerful.
Well, yes. Well, and that might be a good note to end on, having pieced ourselves back together at the very last minute, because we are over time.
Sorry to run over time to talk to you.
It was terrific. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks, James, and thanks, everyone.